2024 has been an amazing year. I want to thank everybody that has subscribed, listened to the podcast, everyone that came on to the podcast. We've had some amazing growth, and we couldn't have done it without all of you. I also wanted to take a minute and just look back at some of the conversations that we had over the course of the year. Thanks, everyone, again, for supporting the podcast, and we look forward to a really successful 2025. In this excerpt with Gerard Vroomen, the founder of Cervelo, we're able to capture a fascinating discussion about the sale of Cervelo in 2012 and the complex emotions that led to that decision. The story illustrates the challenging transition that many startups face as they scale from an entrepreneurial venture to a larger organization, and how founders must sometimes make the difficult decision to step away for the company's benefit.
And so then it looks like at a certain point, you guys decided to let the brand go, I guess, in a sense that you guys had sold the brand in 2012. Was this something that was always in the cards? Did you feel like you were done with that project? You wanted to try something new? I mean, what was the logic behind that?
No, I mean, we were growing, every year and doubling most years, since we started in 95, right? The only exception being 2003, the first year of CSC, we didn't grow at all because we had so many problems with the team and with production and everything. And so we also established eventually an office in Europe so that we could sell direct to stores instead of, through these distributors in certain countries anyways. And we thought doubling sales was normal. We'd never worked in a company that didn't double sales because all we knew was
from college,
ourselves, right?
We went from college,
and so exactly. So we just, our planning was always based on that, and maybe we'd miss the target and only grow 80%, and we'd be annoyed, but we were just completely clueless, and so when the times were good, of course everything is good, and then when the sales started to slow down a little bit. Obviously 2008, there was a financial crisis, and that was just the year that we also launched the Cervelo test team, and, going away from CSC and doing it ourselves. And so the cost, kept increasing, and we thought it doesn't matter, we just double sales and we can easily cover that, right? And so when that didn't quite happen, then it got a lot more stressful. And also just at that point, me being in Europe and Phil being in Canada, communication wasn't that great anymore. And it's not like we had a fallout, but we realized that, hey, we need to streamline this company again. It's gotten a little bit too unwieldy. So we decided to close the European office and focus everything again in Canada, just to get, not only to cut those costs, but also just to become more efficient and just get a better control again over the company. Because it was just difficult to work together with the 6-hour time difference between Europe and Toronto. And so we also then thought, like, what, we should have one CEO, not two. And so I stepped out of the operational side of things in 2011. And so I was still a shareholder, but I didn't have any active role anymore. And then, we were sort of thinking, okay, is this really working out? Like, for me, it was kind of strange. Like, now my pension is sitting there in this company that I have no influence on. And I think Phil was also, we were pretty tired. We'd been doing this for 15 years, and we'd never really taken a break.
Sure.
And, you just get tired after a while, right?
Well, it's like, then,
as long as things are going really well, then your adrenaline will pull you through. But then if you're tired and things are not going so well, then go like, hey, maybe we should sell the company. And so that's, towards the end of 2011, go like, hey, either we need to have more cash in the company, because, you need a lot of cash to grow, but then when the growth slows down, then you also have a cash issue, right?
Sure.
So I thought we need more cash in the company, and then it just makes total sense to sell the whole company. And so there were a bunch of companies interested, and then end of 2011, we sort of provisionally sold the company to Pon, and 2012 that was sort of finalized.
So there's a few different things here that I want to dive into. It's like, this wasn't, at least the way that you're talking about it, this because I've worked with a lot of European entrepreneurs, and their business is like their child, right? It's like their baby. And I've seen situations where, the entrepreneur has a hard time leaving, the entrepreneur has a hard time passing along the control to the next generation. But it sounds like you didn't have quite such a strong connection with this brand from the way you're talking. Am I reading that correctly?
No, I don't think you're reading that correctly. I think I still do. I mean, I love that brand, right? It doesn't happen very often that you can just, start a company, come up with a name, and then, at some point this name means,
More.
like, I mean, it's a made up name, and at some point this name really means something to a lot of people, right? I don't just mean emotionally, but it's like it's a thing now, right? It's like, oh, it's a Cervelo. I own a Cervelo. I ride a Cervelo. Jumbo Visma is sponsored by Cervelo, right? All of a sudden, these 7 letters that are just pretty random when you start, all of a sudden it's really something. And to build that, and with the group of people that we built that with, like we had an incredible engineering team. We had unbelievable people in sales and customer service and marketing, and just people who were maybe, didn't have the usual credentials for those jobs, but just, really, really loved that company and would do anything for that company. Nobody ever complained if we had to work late or whatever it was, right? Everybody just wanted to get the job done. And, that was, yeah, that was just fantastic. So, but I think the last years were just really, really tough. Also, we had some legal issues with other bike companies and other things. And it just, some of the things that are really draining your energy, they just start to become bigger than the ones that give you energy. And also, I mean, I'm not a huge people person. And once we had, between the company and the team, we had 150 people. It was just too big. It just didn't, it is not that I didn't like the people or that I didn't like the brand, but it just gotten too big. So then, I mean, what do? You love the company, but it's gotten too big. Do you force the company to get smaller again? I mean, that's kind of hard to do, right? So I mean, you could, of course, but then you have to fire people that you love. That doesn't really work either. So it was just incompatible. So it didn't really have to do anything with how much I did or didn't love that company or that brand. It was just my personality was just incompatible with the size and the complexity of what that company had become. Because we never thought about this. It's like I always say, it's kind of like the pumpkin contest, right? Where you try to grow as big a pumpkin as possible. And that's sort of how we thought, like that's what a company is. It's something you try to grow as big as possible. I never gave any thought to like what's the correct size of the company or it's like, the only purpose seemed to be, yeah, it's like I had a 6-year-old vision of a company. It's just it's something you're supposed to grow. So that's what we did. And then it was so big that I felt like I don't like this. You can't put it back. Can't put it back in the jar, right?
No, I get it. And there's also
So yeah. So then what do you do? The only thing you can do is leave, right? So, but it's not a reflection of how much I did or didn't like that company or that brand.
No, I get it. I get it. That makes a lot of sense because there's loving a company and then there's being compatible with, having a compatible position with the nature of your skills and your personality that to still be compatible with the company. And one of
Yeah, and we had tried the last years before, we had tried to find a good, COO to take on more daily work. Because I mean, there's certainly that. I mean, there's when we were tired because we worked, very hard at this, and also we were in some areas bumping up to the limits of our skills, or we'd have gone
Sure.
already way beyond it. So we realized we needed somebody with, different skill set to come in and do, a big part of the work. And, but it's very hard. And partially it's probably hard because you're still this owner operator and you have your own ideas. I also think we picked the wrong person. So yeah, if you don't quite have the right person and, you're probably a quite annoying owner operator that's still walking around the business, then, it's going to be very hard to make that a success, right? And so I think it was sort of in the end the perfect storm, right? Where we knew we needed at least one of those kind of people, and that didn't work out. Then financially, it got tougher because of the financial crisis. And, we would always have this bump in January where people on Wall Street get their bonus, right? We didn't get a bump in 2009 or 2010 or 2011, right?
I haven't heard this
Um,
before.
Yeah, honestly, we could see that definitely. And because normally January is not a big month, right, for bike sales. So you really know something's going on. And then when it disappears, bump that again. So, so it was sort of becoming this perfect storm. Like we'd started the team, which was of course costing us a lot more money than being just a sponsor. And the idea for the team was always we would run the team, but we would have somebody else being the title sponsor. But, title sponsors were hard to find in those years of the financial crisis as well. So it was sort of a perfect storm. And then the personal, tiredness and the legal battles and things like that. So yeah, that was really the reason I stepped out. And then, Phil just said, okay, I still feel I can keep going, but I think in the end he was pretty tired too. And I just felt that things were getting worse, not better. So then we decided that it's better to sell it to somebody who's really financially strong and has, has a whole structure and can just, weather these storms and come out the other end.
No, it is a cash flow intensive business. Absolutely. I had a conversation with
It can be.
I had a conversation with Gary Fisher, and it was similar in that sense, where he stayed on operationally with Trek for years, and he was kind of strategically involved with the sourcing and everything like that in Taiwan. But it was a similar situation where he was just like, this thing gets so big where you're just like, you got the tiger by the tail. And you want the thing to continue to grow and you want it to continue to flourish, but there's only so much you can do at a certain point. So makes perfect sense.
Well, I mean, we were a $50 million company doing ordering and the inventory management on a spreadsheet, right? So it was quite intense.
This is a fascinating excerpt where Rapha founder Simon Mottram discusses how being an outsider in the cycling industry actually helped him create Rapha. He explains that traditional cycling culture could be quite exclusive and technically focused, which made many casual enthusiasts feel like outsiders. Mottram positioned Rapha as a more accessible cycling club while still maintaining deep respect and knowledge for the sport's history. Some criticized him for appropriating cycling's heritage, but he defended this by explaining their goal was to make cycling's rich culture and stories accessible to more people. Those can be kind of intense too. Those clubs.
They were super intense. Yeah. They were for people who were super skinny and seemed to just be obsessed with gears. And at the time, it wasn't watts because we hadn't discovered the power of watts or the power of power. They were just obsessed with geeky stuff, and I wasn't like that, and I didn't really want to talk about that, and I was intimidated by the fact that they all raced and they were all fucking hardcore,
and they did. It happens, it happens to everyone where they're like, well, if you're not at the sort of a similar level, you're sort of out in terms of like speed and climbing and endurance and everything like that.
Yeah, and back then that was what it was all about. Whereas now there are, a myriad of great organisations and clubs who are much more accessible. There was no club for me, so I'd never joined one. Yes, hence it was Rapha.cc, partly because I was very happy to call it cycling club. It's like, this is a club for people who like this, not for people who can do a 10-mile time trial in a certain time, or who know that you don't put your glasses under your helmet straps or whatever, although that is quite important. So I hadn't joined a club, but I'd met lots of people, and what I was looking for, if I was an archetype, could I see more people who had the same relationship to the sport as me, and who came from the sort of world that I came from, which was a much more open-minded, broad view than lots of traditional cycling seemed to be. Traditional cycling was, all roads lead to the Muur de Gurrensbergen. All roads lead to some vanishing point of perfection in terms of riding a bike. But they would, in my experience, the people in cycling didn't look at the world of brands and the world of entertainment and the world of travel and the world of luxury and the things that I was sort of spending the rest of my life looking at.
So you felt like an outsider in a sense that you saw a pretty insular world of cycling
I was 100% an outsider, and I've often said that one of the very useful ingredients, sort of characteristics that came into Rapha, that I could put into Rapha, was I was an outsider who was like a regular punter, a nodder, as like, or a Fred or a Hubbard or whatever. Different parts of the world have different derogatory terms for people like me and like most cyclists. Let's be honest, 80% of cyclists are those people, but I was one of those people, so I was on the outside. But I also had spent so long obsessing over it that I was actually a bit of an expert. So I knew who'd won the Tour in 1954. I knew what had happened on an epic day on the Deux Alpes, and I knew the places, the people, the teams, the history, and how that all worked. And I'd have been reading Cycling Weekly for 15 years obsessively, and so I knew the stuff that a club rider would know, but I came at it from a sort of outsider's perspective, and that was so important. And it took 5 or 6 years. I mean, the people in the cycling industry couldn't do what we did because they came from in that world.
Totally.
And I still think there are lots of people who just live in that world, and they will get blindsided by the next big innovation because they're not out there looking, to our previous conversation.
Well, I had a conversation with a brand once that, and they were a historic brand, an older brand, but they have their feet in a lot of different, they have their hands in a lot of different things, whether it be events, whether it be teams or different types of events, historic events, newer events. And I think having that history can also be a handicap at times because you can't create a very focused message. Does that make sense?
Up to a point. I think it can, but that baggage can be very heavy, and I think it's particularly heavy if you're not really a brand person. If you're someone like me, the history is just so exciting. It's, I can feel my heart quickening just thinking about what brand could that have been. Is it Colnago? All the things that you could do with those brands. Oh my God, it's incredible, because I didn't have any of that stuff. And I mean, you're right, there is a weight to that, and there is the crown jewels that you mustn't mess with. But most of that is only a problem because the people in the business don't have any objectivity. They can't see the value, and they don't have the expertise to do something with it.
Okay.
And actually, it's way more powerful to start with something. And I had to create all that. Rapha wasn't a brand. It wasn't a, we created a sort of mythology about Rapha and about cycling. Actually, I mean, the whole point of how we have always done things at Rapha is that it's about cycling, not about Rapha. And by doing that, Rapha has become cycling for lots of people. So we created this weighty, wonderful sort of history, and now we've got 20 years of it ourselves, so we can actually be a bit more factual too. But we celebrated the stories, we celebrated the places, and we were massively criticised for it. I was hugely criticised for it. How can you wrap yourself in the history of the sport? You're stealing our sports history to make your ill-gotten gains, was basically the jibe.
But that's,
you're a fancy marketing person who doesn't,
But you,
when did you ever win a race?
But you are, Simon. But you were.
Yeah, totally.
Well, how do you defend that?
Well, I defend it because it wasn't for ill-gotten gains, and it wasn't for making loads of money. If people saw how little we paid ourselves for the first 10, 15 years, and the amount of effort we put in, what we weren't doing was doing it for ill-gotten gains. There's nothing wrong with celebrating the history or going into a world and telling stories about it and turning it into something incredibly impactful if that gives huge value to other people. And I would argue that what we did was we brought that history to way more people. I mean, we sold more copies of Tim Crabe's The Rider than Amazon for the first 5 or 6 years of Rapha. We were doing these things because we wanted people to understand how brilliant cycling is. And I think that's how you should judge the impact of us wrapping ourselves in the sport. It's, have we turned more people onto cycling? Have we made their cycling lives better? Have we made cycling slightly better for more people? And I would say that Rapha has 100% done that.
I agree. It's, in my experience, you guys elevated the sport with the work that you did, and I think someone needed to tell that story. someone was going to do it sooner or later, and why couldn't it be you guys?
Yeah, you're right. Someone was going to do it, but we could still be waiting for that.
Absolutely.
That's the trouble. It's one of the entrepreneurial things that you just got to do it. You got to get out there and not wait. I couldn't wait for somebody else, and I would have hated it if somebody else had done it. And there were a few people who I got to know or I met in the sort of few years after we'd launched, who were sort of a bit pissed off because they'd obviously had half a thought around the same idea. But there's they could see it was there to be done, as you just said. But there's a massive difference between seeing it and working your guts out to make it real over 10, 15, 20 years. Yeah, the proof, as you said, is, what was the expression about the ball?
The ball don't lie.
The ball
The
don't
ball
lie.
don't lie. It's sort of a way to, at the end of the day, if the ball goes in, you scored. If it doesn't go in, you didn't score. So.
But you have to do it, and that's, I speak a lot to young entrepreneurs now and give them whatever advice I can, but the most important thing is you have to do it.
Action.
If you've written a nice business plan, that's great, but that's, you're with 99% of people who fail. At that point, you've got to get it launched. You've got to keep it going for 2 or 3 years. You've got to make profit. You've got to make consistent profits. You've got to do all these things. Otherwise, it's just an idea.
David Trimble's Red Hook Criterium evolved from a modest birthday party race into an influential cycling event, growing from 20 participants to attracting thousands of spectators and almost 100 athletes by its 3rd year. The event's pivotal moment came when it grew too large to operate without permits, leading to a crucial transition from underground race to legitimate sporting event at the Brooklyn Cruise Terminal. What distinguished the Red Hook Crit was Trimble's understanding that success in New York City required more than just a bike race. It needed to be a unique cultural experience, blending sport with design, art, and photography. This vision naturally attracted partners like Castelli, Giro, and Cinelli, who shared the event's aesthetic sensibilities. Through strategic creative partnerships, particularly with creative director Jonah Burns, the event maintained powerful visual identity and elevated beyond the sport into a cultural phenomenon, demonstrating how athletic competition could successfully merge with creative culture. I remember you once said on an interview or somewhere, you talked about glory.
Right, yeah.
You talked about glory, and you said, nobody wants to come to my birthday party. I'm paraphrasing it, but it was hard to get people to come to my birthday party, but if you gave them the opportunity at glory, they would come. Am I saying that right? Am I remembering that correctly?
Yeah, basically, yeah. So for the bike racers, unless there's a chance at personal glory, they weren't going to come to your party. So yeah, to give them that chance. If you give them that chance, they're going to be there.
Okay. Well, as long as they come. So let's kind of frame this. So you have this experience, you envision this little, at the time, crit, which crits are, obviously pretty popular road crits. And so you sort of just tweaked the crit concept and made it into a fixed gear race. And so the first year, 20 people watching, 20 people racing. And then the next year, I presume it was, you sort of got behind it a little more, and I guess I'm just trying to understand the trajectory because we got a lot to talk about still. But we're only at the birthday party still. So can you give me some context on how that was it just something that sort of started to snowball year over year?
Yeah, it definitely snowballed. The format immediately was successful. It was super fun. Everyone who raced just had the best time, and I raced myself for the first year, and I just I loved the format. It was just so much fun. So I knew I was kind of onto something. So every year I just put a little more effort into it, and each year I tried to fix everything that had gone wrong the year before and do a little bit better job, and then it wasn't long before it started just getting really big. I mean, there's many hours of stories for each year on how it grew, but it basically started attracting press, like the New York Times came and covered the second edition of it. And there's being in New York City, there's all sorts of creatives like photographers and artists, and they kind of caught wind of it, because if you went and watched it, it was crazy. It was like on open streets, and it was dark. It was just very visually spectacular. So all these like amazing photographers were coming out and documenting it, and that just really just started snowballing, and people became aware of it.
And so you were kind of at that point, when did you kind of think, oh my God, I got a tiger by the tail here?
Yeah, I think it wasn't until after the third year is when it started getting really big. The third year was like all of a sudden there was like probably 1,000 people watching it. Yeah, and way more athletes were taking part. We had like 100 athletes race the third year, and then we were still on open streets without permits, and it was really chaotic.
Yeah, I got to ask you that, like, personal liability, like, what was going through your mind, honestly?
I was young. I was young, and there was no money involved, so I didn't care. Like, I knew from like all the alley cats that like historically the organizers never got in trouble. So
Okay,
I wasn't really worried about it.
You knew that you could kind of fly below the radar in case something happened.
Well, I didn't know that. I just didn't want to think about it. So
Sure.
I just, I was young and just living in the moment. And I mean, the cops would come to the race, park their cars around the course, and actually cheer on the athletes. So
Wow.
it wasn't like we wasn't hidden necessarily. It's just, it wasn't big enough to actually cause any issues. And once it became big enough to cause issues, then that's when I had to get more serious. Like before the fourth year, I approached the NYPD precinct in the area, and I inquired on how I could get permits to actually do it more legally. And first thing the detective said, he's like, "I've been looking for you." Like they were already planning on shutting it down that year, because they had seen how big it got the year before. So at that point, it was like, okay, do I keep doing it, or do I stop and just like let it kind of fade away, just because like I had reached the limit of what I could do with it.
Sure. And there are a lot of moments at that where you're kind of like, do I keep doing this? Or
every race. Yeah.
Every race.
But especially in that's the closest it ever went to stopping, because we were told that we couldn't get permits. There's no way we could do it on the streets. Yeah, it was basically 2 weeks before the race, and I had no idea where we were going to do the race. And I was super stressed out. I had secured the first ever sponsor, a company called Eastern Mountain Sports reached out to us. They like loved the event, and they were offering to help pay for it, actually give us money for the first time. And it was 2 weeks before the race, and I had no idea where I was going to do the race. And I just like happened to go have lunch with a friend who worked for the New York City Economic Development Corporation. They controlled the Brooklyn cruise terminal, and she just like kind of randomly suggested like, "Oh, you should just do it at the cruise terminal." And then the rest is history.
Right, because the cruise terminal is it's a bigger location. There's like a big parking lot there. I think it's a parking lot.
Yeah.
And it's sort of a perfect place for a crit.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's off the city streets, not controlled by NYPD. It's controlled by the New York City, New Jersey Port Authority. And I just somehow had this random connection there. And it was the first time they'd ever used that space for an event. Yeah, I mean, I could write a book just about that process.
Right, and that was really close to where you were living.
Yeah, just 2 blocks away. I mean, it was such a good venue that later on in life, the FIA Formula E, like $50 million event was staged there for
That's right.
5 years, which I also worked on. Yeah, it was a pretty crazy turn of events. It's fate.
So you're putting on the first, so that was sort of the first kind of
legal event
breakthrough in terms of where you're like, wow, this could actually be a real thing. Like instead of just an underground, because alley cats are illegal. They're I've worked with these organizations. It's like there's 3 different people that say that they own it, and it's just a mess. And you're saying that at this point it was like, okay, I've got something that's actually legal and could actually be a real
interesting undertaking also for sponsors. So at this point, having like a real format, you did the first race and you're really starting to get some momentum. And I want to note that you have a really good sensibility about design and style, and you're very attentive to branding. I don't know where you got that, but you've always been very like attentive to who you partner with. And you can correct me if I'm wrong, but this is the way that I've always seen it, that you've always wanted to build something like when you built this, which I don't even think we've even said the name. It's called the Red Hook Crit. The Red Hook Crit, you always had partners that had a certain style sensibility, that had sort of a positioning that brought value to the race. Am I interpreting that correctly?
Yeah, I don't think, I think the partners were self-selecting in a way, just because the race was, like you said, like cool and stylish, and had, we paid attention to design. And I think those attracted the brands that also paid attention to design and their positioning. And yeah, I think I figured out from an early time that, like, you're in New York City and there's so many options for events, and everything's like, it's New York City. That's like all the best designers and photographers and like all the coolest people in the world are there. If you want to do something to attract those kinds of people, it has to be really unique. It can't just be a sporting event. It can't just be like a boring bike race. Like you have to have more than just that. And especially working in the design, architecture and design, aesthetics were super important. Being involved in art and photography, and just being around a really creative community made me realize that, like, if you're going to promote a sporting event, it also has to include all those other elements.
Sure.
And I had a lot of luck. I had friends that were super talented, creative, that were able to like help me at the beginning of the race and grow it. The decade-long partnership I had with Jonah Burns, who became the Red Hook creative director, and like
Sure.
super talented graphic designer, and we both had the same kind of aesthetic vision for what a sporting event could be, and just having these like super lucky breaks where I was partnering with the right people who could help promote the event in the way that fit my vision.
Yeah, and I remember in terms of partnerships, Castelli comes to mind. They were really committed. Steve Smith was committed to the event. Giro and Eric Richter was committed to the event. Antonio Colombo and Chinelli, of course.
Yeah. I think the best partners were the ones that, like, we had such a strong vision for the way the race should look, like, from a graphic design standpoint, that the brand that let us do the design and like trusted our vision were the ones that we had the most successful partnerships with.
In this clip with Matthew Stevens, who is currently a cycling announcer, content creator, but was originally one of the early GCN personalities, you can kind of really hear about how he had to make the jump from a steady police career into more of an entrepreneurial role when he was asked to help create the GCN content strategy and business model when it was just starting in the early 2010s. This is a really kind of interesting look at the mind of an entrepreneur and kind of how people really do have to take these leaps in order to build something new, build something from scratch. And this is a really common story that you'll hear throughout the cycling industry, but throughout kind of any industry.
And then I got asked to do appearances and stuff. And it's gathering momentum. So I was a team manager, a police officer, a family man, and this kind of nascent media career was building. And then, so I thought, I've always wanted I'd like to try my hand at commentating. So I literally sent a CV in to Eurosport, and they said, "Got nothing at the moment, but we'll let you know if there's an opening." So this is when they didn't have a lot of races on television, but they had a few. And I got 6 months later, they said, "We've got an opening for this race, the Arctic race of Norway." So I did that. It went down really well. And they said, "Yeah, we could probably use you next year for a bit." So this increasing amount of media work was happening. Then I got a call. I can't remember exactly how it happened, but GCN was just starting end of 2012 into 2013. And I got a call from those guys because I've done some stuff on TV, and they said, "Do you want to come down for an interview? We've got this YouTube channel starting, basically everything to do with just cycling channel. We want a conversation." So I thought, okay, went down, and they said, "Well, do you want to just go to the Vuelta for 10 days and do some reporting for us?" And I said, "Well, doing what exactly?" They said, "Well, we don't really know, but we're just going to get a feel for it." This was very, very early stages. So I took the decision with my wife to just leave the police. I thought,
What?
I can't, there's something special here. Yeah. So it was
Really?
a big deal. Yeah.
That is a big deal. That is a
Yeah,
huge deal. Like you're what, 42, 43,
Yep.
fully formed human child. Your kid's probably what, 10, 11 years old.
Yeah. It's like, it was just coming up. Yeah. 12. Yeah. Yeah.
Your wife must have had a job, I would think.
Well, at that point, right. So go back 2 years. Sorry. So I divorced.
Okay.
I'd separated in a couple of years before that decision was taken. So I was with a new partner, and actually didn't have a lot at that point because it's my choice. Divorces are pretty damaging in many, many ways, although I think it was the right thing to do. So there's a difficult period in my life
Sure.
where I was financially constrained, shall we say.
Yeah.
But I knew, and I was happy in the police, but I knew that the police financially, although I really enjoyed it, there was a ceiling in terms
Limit.
of what I
Yeah.
could earn.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
You know, so I thought, okay,
like any employee
Yeah.
position. Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, and that's about the age, at least in my experience, is where you're kind of like, okay, either I do it now or it's not going to happen. Right.
totally. It was exactly that. And the work there was enough work to sustain me, although it was very ad hoc.
Sure.
It was just,
Yep.
like you just said, and my wife and my now wife, Holly at the time, said, "Well, what's the worst that could happen?" She was working. I'd always get a job of some sort. And actually, I had a really good relationship with my senior officers in the police. And they said, "Look, Matt, you got to go and do this." Actually, there's a guy called Phil, and he was the assistant chief constable, so very high ranking, lived down the road from me and went out with me on a Saturday on my bike. So he got what I was doing. And he said, "Look, for the next 5 years, if you need to come back, there's a job for you."
Oh, and but that mentally helps. That mentally really helps.
Oh,
right?
so that was a mental and also a financial safety net, I guess.
Absolutely. Because, I've done a little bit. I mean, I'm a self-employed person, and you do need some assurances here and there. You need a person with you that is going to support you, because this stuff is no joke. It's not a joke.
No. It was a really big deal. So, but we ultimately took the decision.
And so you went. So you left the police force. This is an amazing story. And you went to the Vuelta with this GCN, these clowns that you didn't know who they were. And
I knew who they were, but I didn't know what we were really.
Right.
So when I say clown, that the thing about GCN which is amazing, really. They had set out this vision, and it was obviously we all know about YouTube, but YouTube then was a very different proposition. And what they were trying to do was curate specific content that consumers could actually look at, like almost like TV. So on a Monday, within cycling, on a Monday, you'd have a certain bit of content Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday. So you'd have different strands of content you could revisit every week. And so it'd be organized rather than just cats falling over, that sort of stuff. This is an oversimplification. So,
but you saw the value. You saw the value in this project.
Yeah, I saw
you
the value
believed in this project.
Yeah, and it looked intriguing. And also we had an amazing amount of editorial freedom. So there's a guy called Simon Weir who set it all up, who came from publishing, had the vision, and went to Google. I think there was some investment as well, but basically Google would fund the channel for a year if the application was successful, or co-fund. I think it was to the tune, and this is all open source, I think it was to the tune of about £1 million investment.
So this wasn't like just an internet startup. I mean, there was some weight behind this thing.
Yeah, there was some weight behind it, but we obviously had to deliver. So it meant creating a channel from zero. So
you were there on day one?
No, I joined 6 months in. So Dan Lloyd, So this was the funny thing. So a couple of years earlier, as the manager of Sigma, I had Dan Lloyd as a rider for me, Simon Richardson as a rider for me,
Sure.
and Tom Last. So they're all the main guys in GCN. And we
Yeah.
all rode in Sigma Sports. We didn't know what was going to happen 2 years down the line. I ended up going and having this interview, and I hadn't exactly lost touch with those guys, but we're just, we're in I was the oldest. Well, actually, Tom was in his 20s, but the other guys were in their 30s. And I landed there for this interview, and they told me who was working there. And I was like, so I knew Dan was there. So Dan's there, Tom and Simon. I thought, I know these guys inside out. We're going to get on like a house on fire.
Sure.
Again. So anyway, I went to the Vuelta, did some reporting on the ground, did my first ever GCN show, which they hadn't told me about. We'd finished the stage, and the camera guy said, "Oh, by the way, we need to record a GCN show now." And I'm like, "What?" He said, "Yeah, we've got a new show to make." And I said, "Well, where's the script?" He said, "Well, you got to make it." So he said, so I was looking at the world of cycling, sat down with a beer for half an hour and scripted this thing in a moleskin journal, very much like this.
Just wrote it out.
And wrote it out, and I started it off with hola, the worst pronounced hello in Spanish, and then my first ever GCN show on location at the Vuelta. Anyway, did that, finished, had a blast, and they said, a lady called Mia, who's still with GCN, said, "Yeah, we're going to hire you, but it will be as a freelancer, just a couple of days a week. So still not a great deal of work." And
a contract. It was a contract.
Yeah, so
It was a freelance contract. Okay.
Yeah, freelance contract, but only a couple of days a week initially. But that soon picked up to kind of 3 days a week, and we were making this content. I moved house, so I was renting at the time in moved down to Bath, or just outside Bath, where GCN is still based.
Sure.
And it was, so we'd go and do shoots, but then certain days a week we'd actually be physically in the office planning and writing scripts for the content that we were putting out. At that point, 1 video a day, and then during the grand tours, we're putting out 2 or 3 videos a day.
And was it just nobody really had roles? It was just, we need to get this done. Let's just get it done.
Well, we had 3 of us writing, or 4 of us actually: Tom, me, Simon, and Dan. And then we had a producer called Mike, who's still with GCN, an amazing guy, and he'd come from television and was a friend of Simon Weir's, who set the whole thing up. They'd been to university, been in college together. And Mike was the driving force. So he didn't write any of the scripts, but he would come up with some ideas like, okay, let's do a video about how to change gear. That's a thing. Do that. So essentially what it was sitting down and looking at what cycling is and breaking it down into all its constituent parts. So basically everything that you see now on social media and YouTube and stuff, we were doing 10 years ago. Nobody else did it. So we're breaking down the component parts and putting it out there as strands. So we did tech stuff, bike reviews, not so much bike reviews, but that's a slightly separate thing because we weren't sponsored at that particular point. But basically we were riding our own bikes. I bought one of my team bikes for $3,500 so I could ride it in the videos, because I'd just kind of retired then from racing itself, or actually 2 years before I retired from racing. So bought back an old team bike, rode those in the videos. And then we were just going to races, going to events, making content that we hoped would be seen. And it took a bit of time to get traction. So we'd go to a big race to speak to a team, for example, and say, "Can we film your bike? We're from a YouTube channel." They're like, "Well, who are you? We don't know who you are. Why would we want to do that?" So for the first year, we didn't have a lot of stuff to show people. So it took a few months. So here's our content, which was getting, a reasonable amount of traction.
Was it growing? I mean,
It was growing. It was growing.
You could feel
it was growing fast.
You could feel the momentum. So you felt good about the project.
Yeah, we felt good. We were having a lot of fun. We were working really hard. They were long days, but we were a small team. We were agile. We were driven. And we were having a lot of fun, and
it's punk rock.
Making stuff.
Sounds like punk rock to me.
And we were making stuff quite quickly, so we didn't ever overthink stuff. We were super professional about what we wanted, but we were taking a few risks. Some of the content was quite loose. We knew that we wanted to, and as we went through a few months, we soon found out between the four of us, in terms of the presenters, what we were good at in terms of presenting styles, and also the content within cycling that we would. So, for example, the tech stuff, Simon was a little bit better at, and Dan. The racing stuff, it was more me. Interviewing riders was more me, and we wanted a bit of a sense of comedy running through the stuff as well, because we had such a laugh. We thought we need to channel this.
Yes.
Cycling is so brutally hard and quite dry, but if you shoot
Serious,
the content through with a lightness of touch, so that's where I came in. Everybody brought something to the table, but my particular contribution was more humour than anything tangible in terms of specialism.
Your dry style.
Yeah, but I could be, I hosted quite a lot of our training videos on the turbo training, which we did because although I wasn't a coach, I think I'm a reasonable motivator, so I was quite good at that side of things. So we all equally did what we did, and then with all the backroom staff as well. Well, the few that there were at that particular time, it got momentum to the point that the business model shifted. The business model initially was just trying to get eyeballs on the content, and we were burning through the investment money, obviously, and so we could go out and travel and pay people. But then there were no brands on board to actually help finance it. So once we got to a critical point, or a point where there was a value proposition, that's when things shifted, and there was brands started to hop on board, and it was all basically product placement in the early days,
of course,
and eventually one-off paid-for videos. So we had a fleet of bikes that were paid for by the different brands, but it took a year of hard graft from everybody, with no real guarantees that it was going to come off. But ultimately,